Stephen Hicks. Welcome to the podcast.
All right, appreciate the invitation.
It's a pleasure and it's an honor for you to come on. So, um, this uh, thing, I'm not a philosophy scholar or it's not my area of expertise. So, I will try my best
Hmm.
to keep up. So,
That's fine. Philosophy for thinking human beings, not only experts.
right. So, postmodernism, what is it?
Hmm. Hmm. Well, if you, as the name suggests, it's after modernism or wants to be after modernism. So I think the best question is to say, what's modernism, and why do the postmoderns think we have to reject it or see it as failed and moving beyond it? So essentially, the modern world is the world that has been created in the last 500 years.
Hmm.
So this is obviously a broad strokes history. So Christopher Columbus crosses the ocean. There's a Protestant Reformation. Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci are the great innovative artists. You see the breakdown of feudalism, the breakdown of the established churches, and more discussion of separation of church and state, discussion of perhaps we should do something about slavery because it's wrong. Maybe we should treat women as equal citizens and not treat everybody as subjects. So the Industrial Revolution, market, capitalistic economics, and so on. So that whole shebang, it's
Hmm.
obviously been a very revolutionary 500 years, and that's the modern world. So what the postmoderns want to do is argue either that the intellectual framework of modernism, this idea that we should be individuals with individual rights, that we have reason, that we can use science to figure out the world and then to do engineering and to make the world a better place, that we've made progress, all of those things, that we can, as postmoderns, say that intellectually
Hmm.
all of that has been a failure, or that that philosophy is wrong or ungrounded. Or we can argue that practically, trying to remake the world through the Industrial Revolution and capitalism has made things worse,
Right.
worse and worse. And that capitalism, for example, maybe has made a lot of the worse, the poor worse off, or that we are exploiting women, right? Or we have ruined the planet. And so the modern world is not only an intellectual failure, but also a practical failure. So we need to reject it all and go do something else, something beyond modernism.
Right. So, a way that this applies to our modern society is this notion that gender is fluid, right?
Mm.
And I think this relates to postmodernism thinking because gender is being seen as a social construct as opposed to a biological fact.
Yes and no. So, yeah, there certainly is a connection. So, if you think in very broad strokes, the moderns would say, there's a natural world. It's matter and energy, and it's cause and effect, and
Hmm.
facts are fact. And one of those sets of facts is a biological set of facts about males and females and sexuality and how reproduction works and so on.
Hmm.
And that when we are thinking about human psychology, of course, psychology is important, but we don't just get to make up whatever truths we want or whatever facts we want, including facts about our biology. We have to be rational and scientific and recognize facts for being facts.
Right.
So the postmoderns, though, will be skeptical and they will say, well, we don't really know what nature is. We can't scientifically prove anything. Instead, we just tell stories. And there's a lot of subjective stories and different individuals and different Groups can tell whatever stories they want about themselves and their identities, and no one can say that anything is better than, or worse, or right or wrong. So if you then apply that to issues of sexuality,
Hmm.
then the postmodern claim applied there would be to say, well, there are no facts underlying, or there's no scientific proof
Right.
about anything sexual. It is just a construct. It might be an individual construct or a social construct. So then everything becomes whatever society allows us to say.
Hmm.
And it becomes then a struggle for who controls the narrative, not who has best identified the scientific facts.
Right. So what you're alluding to is that this whole idea or this whole thinking is brought by. I want to take it back to the idea of being a social construct. How big is society? Because it is a problem nowadays that a lot of people are being,
Yes.
or a lot of voices are being canceled out because they don't accept these ideologies.
Yes.
And that's an issue because you cannot really outline the facts. And it's as
Yes.
simple as whether a man is a man and a female is a female.
Yes.
So now it's very fluid.
Yes.
But where does that stop with this thinking?
Right. Well, that's a great question, and it's a hard and deep question. So if we say, for example, that everything is socially constructive, or it's just a bunch of group narratives, then as you're asking, how do we decide who is society, who
Hmm.
that is doing this constructing, or what is the group that is coming up with this story and the narrative and so on? Now, here, postmoderns, if they are very consistent, will have to say, well, we can't give factual statements about what the groups are and scientific delineations of who's in the group and who is not in the group, because then they have to say society itself is a fluid, and now we start to speak metaphorically,
Hmm.
got a fluid shifting, and then who's in the group and who is not in the group is also a matter of social construct. So the more consistent postmoderns will say, well, there's not a right factual answer about this, and societies are not constant. So it just comes down to being a matter of power. Whoever has power socially is able to define what counts as a group or what counts as a society, and who is in and who is not. And it's not that I am wrong or that I am right. Instead, it becomes a matter of who's in a position to assert their narrative for a significant number of other individuals. And of course, those individuals who don't accept that narrative,
Yeah.
right, or who want to have a different definition, the claim then is that they then have to become more powerful so that they can then change the narrative or change the language that's used and force it on other people. Now,
Right.
that's what we might call hardcore postmodernism that will go down that group. And they'll just say it's just an ongoing power struggle over language,
Hmm.
language being one of the tools that we use in informing groups and maintaining groups. And it's just going to shift. You know, some groups are going to dissolve, some groups will grow, some groups will overtake various other groups, and some groups will mix and match with various other groups. And that's just the way it is. There's no right or wrong. Now, less
Hmm.
extreme postmoderns sometimes argue that there is some a kind of an intermediate position where we will say that there seem to be stable groups
Hmm.
across times. Maybe they have organized themselves into religious groups or ethnic groups or racial groups
Hmm.
or gender groups. And so what we will then do is to say that those groups have a historical, something close to fixity,
Hmm.
such that they have captured so many people's minds and they have rooted themselves in social institutions so deeply that we might as well take them as given facts. So in my generation, I'm not, like the modernists say, I might be born into a group. And instead of
Mhm.
thinking of myself as an individual who has his own mind and can decide my own identity and explore and so forth, what I really ought to just do is to see what are the most rooted groups that I happen to
Mhm.
be a part of. I might be in the male group, I might be in the Caucasian group, I might be in the Protestant group, I might be in the Canadian group, and so on. So
Right.
all of these things are pretty fixed, and I should just adopt that group identity or see myself as an overlapping set of those group identities, and that then becomes my narrative. And the more I tell myself that narrative, that more constructs my identity. But they will still not
Mhm.
say that any of those groups are, set in stone
Right.
or fixed by natural law. They will just simply have a more traditionalist understanding of how societies work. And in many
Mhm.
cases, this then merges in with a lot of traditional conservative thought. Not to put too many labels out at the same time, but some of the more radical postmoderns, they like the fluidity because they want to change everything and they want the social constructs to be dissolved so they can have new social constructs. Where some of them are more fine with forming alliances with conservatives and saying that I am just a part of this socially constructed group. And I don't say that
Right.
it's based in natural fact. It just happens to be the identity that I'm comfortable with.
Right. So going back to the power dynamics, correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't this idea contradict what postmodernists believe that they want to fight against uh, power dynamics relating to a man and a woman's role in society?
Mm, yeah. Well, some postmodernists who are not very careful, right, will
Mm.
go back and forth on that, and they will speak that contradiction. They will say everything is just subjective, everything is just social constructs, there are no facts, and so forth. It's all just power dynamics. But then at the same time, they will, at other moments, or sorry, that's not at the same time,
Right.
but both are in their heads at the same time, just as different parts of their heads are speaking. They will talk as if some forms of power dynamics are unjust. Some forms of power dynamics are wrong. They are exploitative.
Hmm.
Imperialism is wrong, colonialism is wrong, racism is wrong, sexism is wrong, and so on. And they will speak in a way that makes it sound like they think that those things are objectively, factually wrong. Now, the interesting thing then is whether they've sorted this out in their thinking, or if they've just grown up to believe that certain things are wrong
Hmm.
and that there are some uses of power that are abusive. But at the same time, they've also, when they've tried to do some cognition theory or epistemology and thinking about knowledge, come to some skeptical conclusions that there are no such things as objective injustices and so on, and they just haven't sorted that out in their thinking.
Hmm.
And that's, I think, going to be a large demographic there. But the more
Hmm.
clever, and I think the more educated among the postmodernists, when you point out that there is a contradiction here, if you say that everything is subjective slash relative slash social construct and it's all just power dynamics and there's no right and wrong, and then at the same time, you point out, well, wait a minute, a little while ago, you were saying racism really is wrong or imperialism really was wrong. How do you put those two together? What they will typically then say is, well, when you talk to me, so to speak, as a philosopher, I will
Hmm.
be a postmodern and everything is socially constructed. But when I am trying to use language in
Hmm.
society as a power tool, one thing that is very useful is using absolutist, objectivist language. Because if I say, well, everything is just subjective and here are my very firm subjective opinions, no one's really going to listen to me. On the other hand, if I come across as really having moral beliefs and really believing in justice and injustice, and I can use that language
Mhm.
because you also believe in justice and injustice to try to shift your thinking, then that becomes a useful power tool. So then I will use the language of justice as a tool, but not really believe in the language of justice.
Mm.
So an analogy here would be to think of a lawyer in a courtroom who's trying to convince a jury. Right.
Right.
Now, this lawyer might be very cynical and very skeptical and say, there's no truth. It's just a power struggle. But at the same time, I know that on the jury, there are
Mm.
lots of people who think there is justice and
Yeah.
there's innocence and there's guilt and so on. So even though I don't believe in justice, I might say, get into high rhetoric as a lawyer when I'm talking to the juror and say, and this is a terrible injustice that has been done, and here are the facts of the case, and so on,
Mhm.
because I'm trying to use my rhetorical power to influence the jury. And it's
Mhm.
not that I really believe the words that I'm using.
Right. And I don't know if this relates to that, but I think this is why we use common law a, as an outline for our laws, and that's why we implemented common law, because there were a set of rules that we believed, and we knew those were factually right, and we then uh, implemented that into our I should say into our laws, and then we instituted the Supreme Court to interpret what the Constitution says, and then so on and so on and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But only because something is law does not necessarily mean that it's ethical, as we've learned throughout history, that sometimes we had a certain law and we made society follow that law, but it wasn't ethical.
Yes.
So that was fluid as well. So sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, to a certain
Yes.
extent.
Yes. Okay, that's a very interesting and complex set of issues there. So, if we take the law, right,
Yeah.
as and a very important set of principles governing society, how are we to understand the law? And as you are saying, one of the things that's important, this goes back mostly to the British system in English common law, and then
Mhm.
a lot of that was imported to the United States. So the we here is America. And the idea here is that the law should not be just made up by the king
Yeah.
and imposed on other people. That would be a kind of subjectivism. Right?
Right.
And the king, if we think the king is just a powerful guy, then we're just saying that might makes right. Instead, the idea of common law was that we should be able to have a jury, just to take one institutional vehicle for that, and that we think that people are rational enough, they have a capacity for reason, and they can attend to facts, and there really are facts, and we can discover facts and we can put them together. And some situations are closer than other situations are. So we need to not just say that it's just one very general principle and we just apply it
Mhm.
mechanically to all of the cases. We are looking for commonalities, but we're also paying attention to the particularity of each case. So over the course of decades and then centuries, we build up from the bottom up, looking at various factual cases that should be understandable and thought through by ordinary people who are smart enough to be able to do so.
Right.
So that's a worked out now modern legal system. Now, part of the complexity, though, is that I think if we take the common law as it was developed in Britain, and a lot of
Mhm.
that then transplanted across the sea to early America, the Americans were also more modernistic in that they thought, yes, we do all of this case by case, fact by fact, building up in the common law tradition. But now that we've been doing that for a certain number of centuries, we
Mhm.
are able to abstract to more general universal principles. And those are going to be constitutional principles. And we're going to say that no new common law, so to speak,
Hmm.
decision is going to be able to contradict these common law, these constitutional principles now. So it's
Right.
by analogy to thinking of the law as a kind of science that
Hmm.
we might, in the scientific field, say we've done this experiment in chemistry and this experiment in chemistry, and we got past alchemy, and now we're into chemistry with thousands and thousands of experiments and their results. But at a certain point, we can generalize to the periodic table and say that these are very firm, absolute scientific principles. Now,
Mm.
then at the same time, though, with the constitutional principles, we want to say that as good scientists, if we can find that we've missed out on some constitutional principle, we should be
Hmm.
able to add them later on. And
Yeah.
also, if we have overgeneralized some constitutional principle, and we find that there are new circumstances that
Hmm.
it doesn't fit, we should also be open to revising those constitutional principles as well. So that's by analogy then to say the way we are thinking about the law is the same way we are thinking about science, and it's the
Hmm.
same general methodology. And it's a shuttling back and forth between fact-based empirical principles and experiments or common law decisions and more general scientific laws or constitutional principles that are highly abstract in general. And we need to be able to go up and down that level of abstraction fairly consistently. And that was the first
Hmm.
half of your very rich question.
Yeah, but moving on, I do have a question that I really want to get your insights on.
Okay.
So, uh, with the next coming decades, well, the following decades, where do you see ideas evolving to? Because philosophy doesn't necessarily evolve as social ideology does.
Mm, mm. So, where the next decades are going in terms of philosophy, or philosophy in relation to its typically slower pace and the change in social ideologies faster pace.
Yeah, like social ideology. So, this whole thing about gender being a social construct, it's
Ah,
relatively new to us, which
yes.
hasn't really been discussed. And now you need to accept these certain principles. So philosophy doesn't necessarily evolve as much as social ideology does because we see it
Okay.
at a faster pace than we see
Mm.
philosophy.
Yes, no, I think that's true. Philosophy operates at a very high level of abstraction, and virtually all of the major philosophical options were worked out a long time ago by geniuses across the centuries. So it's not necessarily the case that philosophy is going to change as dramatically. Instead, typically what happens is in every generation, one of the major philosophical outlooks, a
Hmm.
new version of it arises, and it has some brilliant and sometimes charismatic people who are advocating for it. And so it becomes the leading philosophy of that era. And it's never that the other philosophies go away, is that they become minority philosophical movements. So we've seen that, for example, in the last, say, two generations from the last part of the 20th century. Postmodernism was the hot, sexy new thing philosophically. And it's not that it was that new, because it, in effect, was a reworking and updating of various skeptical, relativistic, sophistical themes that were kicked around by the ancient Greeks even 2,500 years ago. But it was hot for a while. But then at the same time, this is the other part of it. If we go down some levels of abstraction, we say, well, we're not talking about philosophy in general. We're talking about what does philosophy mean for science or for law
Hmm.
or for sexuality or for politics or for religion. Those issues are talked about explicitly, not by a handful of philosophers, but by hundreds, thousands, or in modern times, millions of people, and which issues come to the fore is harder to predict. How
Yeah.
long they're going to stay at the fore is also harder to predict. And we tend to cycle through all of those issues at a much faster rate. So, for example, if the issue of sex and gender is coming
Mm-hmm.
up, you might say, that really issues of sex and gender, we haven't talked about them very much until later in the modern world
Mm-hmm.
because much of intellectual life was dominated by religious worldviews prior to the
Right.
modern world. And religions were, to put it mildly, terribly uncomfortable talking about sexuality. And they had institutionalized certain norms about sexuality, and it was hard for those to be challenged. And it wasn't really until, say, this is a little bit overstated, say Charles Darwin,
Mm-hmm.
when biology comes to the fore as a serious science, and everybody is talking about biology, and sexuality is a huge part of, uh, of doing biology. So then it's only a century and a half that we have seriously gotten into the biology, and again, thousands and millions of people. And then on the political side of things, it wasn't really until after World War I that women started to enter the workforce, get more serious education, get the vote, and started to assert their own views on what their lives were, including their own sexuality. And that picks up at World War I, World War II, this so-called sexual revolution of the 1960s, and so on. So it's only really in the last century or so,
Right.
with biology and these political and cultural movements, that sexuality has come to the fore. So I think you're right to say that we are just getting warmed up on these issues.
Yeah, because what we know from archaeologists and digging up bones, they're able to determine whether
Sure.
someone was a man or someone was a woman,
Yes.
because
Yes.
the differences in their gender or sex, I should say,
Yes.
differs.
Yes. Sure. And all of this territory is extraordinarily complicated. So you're mentioning the archaeological evidence, and that's based on skeletal remains, and skeletal remains are a function of the biological life form, and then the sexual dimorphism of male and female. But then we also know that just getting all of that basic biology sorted out, and then all of the cellular level stuff and the other physiological stuff, but then all of that has to work with our understanding of human psychology.
Hmm.
So one's sexual psychology often tracks onto one's underlying biology, but we already know psychology can be much more fluid and much more all over the map. And again, we are still in the very early days of scientific psychology.
Hmm.
And that's extraordinarily complicated as well. And then on top of that, we also know that there is all of the sociology, for example. So
Hmm.
sexual psychology is one thing, and how one expresses one's sexuality as an individual. But we also know that male and female, and the psychological expression of male and female in different societies has also been extraordinarily different. Clothing,
Hmm.
food, division of labor, and so on. So, how much of that social variation
Hmm.
in the expression of gender is rooted in psychology and rooted in biology? We're still in the very early stages of all of that as well.
Yeah, because what it has me thinking is, where does it stop? If these
Mm.
principles are accepted by society, does it stop at race, age, maybe someone's wealth, the physical reality of the world?
Mm.
You can't lie on your taxes and say, well, I feel like I'm making less than what I'm actually making, right?
Sure. Yeah, that's right.
So where does it stop?
Or when you're 40, I identify as a 9-year-old, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I just don't know if these principles are accepted, or this ideology is accepted by
Mm.
society.
Yes.
it would just keep going because
Right. No, well, that's the question. Where it ends will depend on our decisions about how we're going to have this discussion or this set of discussions that you are laying out here. And the moderns, their argument is all of these things are very complicated, but there are facts, and we should pay attention to the facts, get the evidence, do the reasoning, do the logic, do the science, and the discussion will go according to what the facts seem to dictate, according to our best science. And it's not that we are omniscient or that we think that the science is ever going to be complete. So it's going to be an ongoing discussion, but that's how we are going to have that discussion. And the postmoderns are saying, no, that's not how we're going to have the discussion. Discussion is going to be a power struggle, and we don't really think that there are facts. We just think it's going to be competing subjective ideologies at the individual or the group level, and we're just going to enter into that messy battle and
right.
seeing it as a power struggle and brace yourself.
Yeah, because what I believe is that people are inherently good. So it's in our biology to be respectful. So we want to respect someone's ideology if they want to identify as a woman, if they're a man. We try to be respectful in that way for the most
Mm,
part. But it's getting into accepting these principles or this accepting this ideology and saying,
yes.
well, there's a difference between gender and sex as they've tried to explain. But if someone identifies as a woman, which they're really a man, but if you say
Mm,
that they're male, it's going to get very blurry in the way that even though they identify
sure,
as a woman, you cannot
sure.
identify them as a male, which is more factually correct.
That's right. And so all of those issues about the context dependence of how we use words, what are we trying to pick out in reality when we are using those words, and our commitment to, at least in modern society, not necessarily respecting people's ideologies, but respecting people's right to form their own ideologies, and under what circumstances we will agree with their ideology or disagree but tolerate their ideology, or disagree and say, no, we cannot tolerate that particular expression of your ideology. So it's one thing to say, for example, so you have someone who is biologically a man but identifies as a woman, right? To take
Right.
that language. And you meet this person at a party. It's a social event, and the person says, my name is, gives a feminine name, and you have some empirical evidence from looking at this person
Right.
that one might be biologically male. Well, that is one circumstance. That's a social context. And what seems to be appropriate in that case would probably be to say, okay, you treat this person as a woman, you accept their ideological self identification. If by contrast, the circumstance is different, you are a medical doctor and someone comes into your office dressed socially as a woman, gives a woman's name, and asks or requires you to treat this person entirely as a woman, not only in terms of social expression, but also in terms of biological identity. Well, that's a different situation. And probably the medical doctor would then say, look, I'm going to have to talk to you in two different languages or two related languages. I will call you by your feminine name. That's perfectly fine. And we will relate that way. But when there are biological medical facts at issue here, you have testicular cancer, for example. We're not going to pretend that that's not a fact of the situation
Yeah.
because it doesn't fit with your ideology. Versus if we are archaeologists, as you were saying, that's going to be a different circumstance. If we are cell biologists and so forth. So I think there are hundreds of different social circumstances where these issues are going to come out, and we have to talk through all of them and figure out what the appropriate norms are in each.
Right. Well, listen, this has been a really fascinating conversation and really,
Enjoyed it. Yes.
really
You got
in
into the
depth.
deep stuff quickly and nicely. Thanks for that.
Well, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate your time. And I know we had a short time, but I feel like we did touch on a lot of topics.
Great, great. All right, Erik, all the best to you for the new year.
Thank you so much.